Victoria tightened her grip on the microphone as she stood on the church altar. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on her. She took a breath and spoke. My name is Victoria, and 3 months ago, my life was falling apart financially. The room grew quiet. People always pay attention when a testimony started with trouble. I had started a project earlier this year, but halfway through it, the money finished completely. A few people nodded. They understood that kind of problem. Victoria continued. I prayed about it every day. I asked God to help me because I honestly didn't know what to do anymore. Her voice steadied. But something happened that I still cannot explain. An investment I made some time ago suddenly exploded in value. A few people murmured. At first, I thought it was an error. But when I checked properly, the profits had multiplied. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Victoria continued. That money solved the entire financial problem I was facing. I completed the project successfully. She paused. And after everything, I still had millions left. The reaction was instant. The church erupted. Hallelujah! People clapped loudly. Someone shouted, God is good! Another voice said, what a miracle! Victoria stood there awkwardly for a moment as the excitement continued. She wasn't used to so much attention. I just want to encourage someone, she added quickly. Don't give up when things look impossible. God can still surprise you. More applause followed. Finally, she returned the microphone and stepped down from the altar. Several people smiled at her as she walked back to her seat. A few whispered congratulations. Victoria simply nodded politely. She felt relieved. Sharing the testimony had taken courage, but she was glad she had done it. After the service ended, Victoria stepped outside and began walking towards the church gate. She planned to go home straight. But before she reached her car, a woman hurried towards her. Sister Victoria! She turned. The woman looked anxious. I heard your testimony during service, she said. Victoria smiled politely. Thank you. The woman clasped her hands together nervously. My daughter's school fees are overdue, she said quickly. They're about to send her home from school. Victoria felt a small knot tighten in her stomach. The woman continued. When you said God blessed you with millions, I just believed maybe God could use you to help me. Victoria froze. She hadn't expected that. Not at all. She glanced around. A few church members were still standing nearby. Some were already looking in their direction. Victoria had just finished standing on the altar, thanking God for financial blessings. Refusing this woman now would make her look terrible. The woman continued speaking. I am not asking for everything. Even half of the amount will help me. Victoria hesitated. She barely knew this person, but the woman looked desperate. Victoria sighed quietly. All right, I can help with half, Victoria replied. The woman's eyes widened with relief. She nearly burst into tears. God bless you. Within minutes, the transfer was done. The woman kept thanking her again and again before leaving finally. Victoria eventually got into her car and drove home. She assumed that would be the end of it. But the following Sunday, another person approached her. This time, it was a young man she had seen in church a few times. Sister Vic, please wait. She stopped. The man spoke quickly. I heard your testimony last week. I've been praying that God would connect me with someone who can help me pay my rent. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. This again? He continued pleading. Even if it's not the full amount, anything will help. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. She didn't want to go through this again, but people were walking past them. And once again, the same thoughts crossed her mind. She just shared a testimony about millions. Refusing now would make her look heartless. So, she helped him too. But this time, Something inside her felt uneasy. As she drove home that day, one thought kept repeating in her mind. Sharing that testimony might have been a mistake, because now people were beginning to see her as something she had never intended to become, a solution to their financial problems. And Victoria had no idea that this was only the beginning. And so, the requests did not stop. If anything, they multiplied. At first, Victoria told herself it was just coincidence. Maybe the first two people were genuinely desperate. Maybe it wouldn't continue. But by the third week after her testimony, it was clear something had changed. The moment service ended, people began watching her, not in the normal friendly way, but in the quiet, calculating way people watch someone they believe has something they need. Victoria noticed it immediately. That Sunday, she stayed seated longer than usual after the closing prayer, pretending to arrange things in her handbag. She was hoping most people would leave first, but the moment she stood up and started walking towards the exit, a man stepped in front of her. "Victoria, please wait." She forced a polite smile. "Yes?" The man looked embarrassed. "I heard your testimony some weeks ago." "Of course you did," she thought silently. He rubbed his hands together nervously. "My business has been struggling lately. I was hoping maybe you could help me with something small." Victoria felt the familiar pressure tightening around her chest. It was always the same pattern. They mentioned the testimony, then they mentioned their problem. Then they looked at her with hopeful eyes, almost as if the testimony she shared had turned her into a solution machine. "I am sorry," she said gently. "I can't help right now." The man looked disappointed. "Oh, okay." He walked away slowly. Victoria felt a wave of relief. For once, she had said no, but that relief didn't last long, because just outside the church building, another woman approached her. This one was older. "Victoria, good afternoon." "Good afternoon, ma. I have been wanting to talk to you since your testimony." Victoria already felt tired. The woman began explaining how her son needed money to travel abroad. Victoria listened for about 30 seconds before interrupting softly. "I am sorry, ma. I can't help right now." The woman frowned slightly. "But you said during your testimony that God blessed you." "Yes," Victoria replied carefully. "Then why can't you help someone?" Victoria was torn by the question. For a moment, she didn't even know how to respond. The woman shook her head and walked away. Victoria stood there quietly. Something about that interaction left a bitter taste in her mouth. She got into her car and drove home with a strange heaviness in her chest. She had shared the testimony to glorify God, but now it felt like people were using it as reason to demand things from her. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria changed her routine. Immediately after service ended, she would slip out quickly before people could stop her. Sometimes, she even left before the final prayer. It worked for a while. But then, one Sunday, someone was already waiting for her outside. Victoria saw her the moment she stepped out of the building. The woman was standing near the walkway with her arms folded. Her name was Linda. Victoria had seen her around church many times. Linda was known as one of the most talkative members. She seemed to know everyone and everything happening in the church. The moment Linda saw Victoria, she waved enthusiastically. "Victoria!" Victoria forced a polite smile. "Hello, Linda." Linda walked closer. "I've been looking for you." Victoria's stomach tightened slightly. "For me?" "Yes," Linda said cheerfully. "I need your help." There it was again. Victoria sighed quietly inside. Linda began explaining her situation. According to her, she had been planning to start a small clothing business for months, but she didn't have enough capital. "When you shared that testimony about how God blessed you financially," Linda said, "I just knew God had connected me to the right person." Victoria felt trapped again. "Linda, I don't need too much," Linda continued quickly. "Just enough to help me start." Victoria hesitated. She had already made a decision not to continue giving money to people like this. But Linda kept talking. "It will change my life," she said dramatically. Victoria finally spoke. "I'll see what I can do." Linda's face lit up instantly. "Thank you." Victoria nodded politely, but as she walked away, she felt uneasy because she knew something Linda didn't. She had no intention of giving her money. "I'll see what I can do" was simply the easiest way to end the conversation. The following Sunday, Linda approached her again. "So, have you thought about it?" Victoria blinked. "Thought about what?" "The help you promised." Victoria frowned. "I didn't promise anything. I only said I would see what I could do." Linda laughed lightly. "That's the same thing." "No, it's not," Victoria said calmly. Linda looked slightly irritated but forced a smile. "Okay, just let me know." Another week passed. Again, Linda approached her. "Victoria, any updates?" Victoria was beginning to feel annoyed. "I am sorry, Linda. I can't help." Linda's expression hardened. "But you said you would." "I said I will see what I could do," Victoria repeated. Linda stared at her for a moment. Then she said something that made Victoria uncomfortable. "That's not what I expected from someone God has blessed so much." Victoria felt a flash of anger, but she controlled herself. "I am sorry," she said again. Then she walked away, but Linda wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, she kept approaching Victoria. After Sunday services, during midweek meetings, even in the parking lot, each time she reminded her about the money, each time Victoria gave the same answer: "I can't help." Eventually, Linda stopped asking, at least directly. Victoria thought the issue had finally ended, but she didn't realize something dangerous had already started. Linda had begun talking. At first, it sounded harmless. Just quiet conversations after service, small whispers between 2 or 3 people standing under the trees outside the church. But every single time, Linda was the one speaking. She would lower her voice slightly, lean closer to the person beside her, and begin with the same carefully planted seed. "Have you noticed something about that, Victoria?" The other person would usually ask, "What do you mean?" Linda would sigh, as if she was struggling to say something she wasn't supposed to reveal. "I don't know, but something about that testimony doesn't sit right with me." Curiosity always did the rest. "What testimony?" "That one she shared about suddenly making millions." Then Linda would shake her head slowly. "I'm just saying, money like that doesn't appear from nowhere." At first, the comments sounded like harmless doubt, but within days, Linda's whispers became more pointed. One afternoon after the midweek service, she was heard telling a small group of women near the parking lot, "I have heard things about her." The woman leaned closer immediately. "What things?" Linda hesitated, pretending to be reluctant. "Well, someone told me she moves with very powerful men." "Powerful men?" one woman asked. Linda nodded. "Politicians, billionaires, those kinds of men." The women exchanged looks. "And then she comes to church and boldly says God did it." Linda continued, shaking her head. "Some people are very bold." The story spread fast. Soon, another version appeared. This time the whisper was darker. "I heard she slept with rich men." "Rich married men?" "Married men?" someone asked in shock. "Yes," the reply came. "That's how some women maintain that kind of lifestyle." By the following week, the rumors had grown even worse. Now people were saying Victoria kept company with internet fraudsters. "I heard some of those boys are the ones funding her." Someone murmured during a small group conversation. "And she comes to church to give testimony?" Another person replied with disbelief. Then the ugliest version of the rumor began to circulate. It started once again from Linda. Standing near the church entrance one Sunday afternoon, she whispered to 2 women, "Honestly, women these days can do anything for money." The women looked confused. Linda leaned closer. "I am not saying it's true, But someone told me she might even be involved in ritual money. The two women gasped. Linda shrugged slowly. I mean, look at how suddenly she became rich. By the time the rumors finished spreading through the church, Victoria's testimony had been completely twisted. The miracle she had shared with gratitude had been turned into something dirty. Some people looked at her with suspicion, others with quiet judgment. A few even shook their heads in disappointment whenever her name came up. Within few days, the gossip had spread through large parts of the church, and the painful part was this: Victoria had no idea that her name, her character, and her faith were slowly being destroyed behind her back, all because she refused to give Linda money. The next Sunday, Victoria noticed it the moment she stepped into the church that morning. Something felt wrong. At first, she couldn't explain it, but as she walked down the aisle towards her usual seat, the feeling grew stronger. People were looking at her, not the normal friendly glances she was used to. These were different: quick looks, whispers, then sudden silence whenever she passed by. Victoria tried to ignore it. Maybe she was imagining things. She sat down and opened the Bible, pretending to focus on the service that was about to begin. But even then, she could feel it, the tension in the air. Two women sitting behind her were whispering. She caught fragments of their conversation. That's her. Are you serious? That's what I heard. Victoria's finger tightened slightly around her Bible. Her heart began beating faster. What are they talking about? The choir began singing, but Victoria found it hard to concentrate. Every now and then she noticed someone glancing at her. Some people quickly looked away when their eyes met hers. Others didn't even bother hiding it. They simply stared. The entire service felt strange. Even when the pastor began preaching, Victoria could hardly follow what he was saying. Her mind kept replaying the same question. Why is everyone looking at me like this? After the service ended, Victoria decided not to wait around. She stood up immediately and started heading towards the exit, but the whispers followed her. She heard someone say quietly behind her, "That's the lady." Another voice replied, "She doesn't even look ashamed." Victoria's chest tightened. Ashamed? Ashamed of what? She walked faster. By the time she reached the parking area, her hands were slightly shaking. Something was definitely wrong. She got into her car and closed the door. For a few seconds, she just sat there, staring ahead. Then she started the engine and drove home. The entire drive felt heavy. Her mind kept trying to piece things together. Had she offended someone? Did something happen in church that she didn't know about? Nothing made sense. When she finally reached home, she dropped her bag on the couch and sat down. Her phone buzzed a few minutes later. It was Sarah. She answered casually. "Hello." Sarah's voice sounded unusually careful. "Victoria, are you home?" "Yes, I just got back." That was a brief pause. "I have been wondering whether I should tell you this," Sarah said. Victoria frowned slightly. "Tell me what?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "There are things being said about you in church." Victoria sat upright. "What do you mean?" "There are rumors going around about your testimony." "My testimony?" "Yes." Sarah lowered her voice. "People are saying the money you talked about didn't come the way you said it did." Victoria went still. What are you talking about?" Sarah continued carefully. "Some people are saying you are involved with rich married men, that they are the ones funding your lifestyle." Victoria stared ahead in disbelief. "Others are saying you move with politicians and wealthy men, that they are the ones behind the money." Victoria let out a sharp breath. "That's insane." Sarah's voice softened. "And some people believe you are connected to internet fraud. A few people are saying something even darker." Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Just say everything." "They are saying you might be involved in ritual money." Silence fell between them. After a moment, Victoria spoke again, her voice low. Who started this? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Then she said quietly, Linda. Victoria's jaw tightened. Of course. Sarah continued. She's been telling people your testimony doesn't make sense. She keeps asking how someone suddenly gets millions. Victoria felt anger rising slowly inside her. All because I refused to give her money? And people believed her? Victoria asked. Sarah sighed. You know how rumors spread. Victoria leaned back on the couch. She understood something painful. Rumors didn't have to be logical. They only have to be interesting. That explains the looks today, she murmured. The whispers, the way people were staring. Now, everything made sense. Her reputation had already been destroyed, and she had walked into church that morning without knowing it. I thought you should know. Sarah spoke again, gently. Thank you for telling me, she replied quietly. When the call ended, Victoria remained seated in silence. Her mind replayed everything, the altar, the applause, the congratulations, and now, the whispers, the accusations, the judgment. Tears slowly filled her eyes. She wiped them away quickly. I was just thanking God, she whispered to herself. That was all she had done. But somehow, it had turned into something ugly, painful, and humiliating. And as she sat there in the quiet of her living room, one painful thought kept repeating in her mind. Sharing that testimony had been the worst mistake she ever made. Victoria did not return to the church the following Sunday or the Sunday after that. The first week, a few people noticed her absence. By the second week, most had already moved on to other discussions, but the rumors about her did not disappear. In fact, they continued to circulate in quiet conversations. Some people spoke about her with disappointment, others with curiosity. A few even repeated the stories as if they were confirmed facts. Meanwhile, Victoria stayed away. The first few days were the hardest. She kept replaying everything in her mind, the whispers, the accusations, the moment Sarah told her what people believed about her. But after the shock faded, something else replaced it. Clarity. For the first time since the whole situation began, Victoria sat down and looked carefully at her finances. She opened her laptop one evening and logged into her investment account. The numbers on the screen were still unbelievable. Even though months had passed, she still sometimes stared at the figures in quiet amazement, because the truth behind her testimony was far simpler than the stories people had invented. 2 years earlier, Victoria had invested a large portion of her savings into a cryptocurrency project. At the time, she had spent weeks studying it, reading about the technology, watching market trends, listening to analysts who believed the project had strong potential. Eventually, she decided to take the risk. She invested the money and waited. For a while, things looked promising. Then, the market crashed. Within months, the value of her investment dropped so badly that she stopped checking it altogether. Every time she looked at the numbers, it felt like watching her savings disappear. Eventually, she convinced herself the money was gone. A painful mistake, but life continued. She focused on her work and moved forward. Then something unexpected happened. About 3 months before the testimony she shared in church, the market suddenly began recovering. At first, she ignored the notifications. Cryptocurrency markets were unpredictable. Prices rose and fell all the time. But the notifications kept coming. One night, out of curiosity, she finally opened her investment account again. The moment she saw the numbers, she froze. The value of the project had skyrocketed. What she originally invested had multiplied many times over. At first, she thought it was a glitch. She refreshed the page several times. The numbers stayed the same. Victoria sat there staring at the screen in disbelief. After confirming everything carefully, she withdrew part of the profits. That money solved the financial pressure she had been facing. It helped her complete the project she had started. And after settling her immediate responsibilities, she invested most of the remaining profits into other opportunities. That was the real story. There were no politicians, no married men, and certainly no rituals, just patience, research, risk, and a surprising market recovery. But none of that mattered now, because the church had already decided what they believed. Victoria leaned back in her chair and sighed quietly. Life outside the church continued moving forward. Her investment continued growing slowly. The project she had completed began bringing steady income, and gradually, the painful memory of the rumors started fading. But the situation she left behind in the church was still unfolding. Linda, on the other hand, was enjoying the attention her story had created. People often approached her to ask questions about Victoria. Each time she repeated the same dramatic tone. "I am not saying everything I heard is true." Then she would lean closer. "But something about that testimony never made sense." The rumors continued circulating for months, until one Sunday afternoon, something unexpected happened. Sarah was standing outside the church building with two other women when the topic came up again. One of them said casually, "Have you heard anything about Victoria lately?" Linda, who was standing nearby, immediately joined the conversation. "I heard she moved to another church." Sarah frowned slightly. "Actually, that's not true." Linda raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" "Yes," Sarah replied calmly. "She's been focusing on her business." "What business?" someone asked. Sarah took out her phone. She invested in cryptocurrency. The woman looked confused. Sarah opened a financial article on her screen. This project she invested in, it exploded in value earlier this year. She showed them the report. The price increased massively within a few months. Linda's confident expression began fading. One of the women looked shocked. "So, all those rumors?" Sarah shrugged slightly. "They were not true." For a moment, no one spoke. Linda shifted slightly, folding her arms as if trying to brush the matter aside. "Well, how were we supposed to know that?" she said defensively. Sarah looked straight at her. "Oh, you knew enough to start the story," she replied calmly. The women around them fell silent. Sarah continued, her voice steady. "You were the one who went to Victoria asking for money, remember?" Linda's expression changed slightly. "And when she told you she couldn't help, that's when all these rumors suddenly started appearing," Sarah added. No one interrupted. "You told people her testimony didn't make sense," Sarah went on. "You were the one asking everyone where she suddenly got millions from." Linda opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Sarah didn't raise her voice. She simply said what everyone needed to hear. "So, let's not pretend this was confusion. You were angry she didn't give you money, and you turned that anger into gossip." The silence around them became heavier. For the first time since the rumors began, the story had finally turned back to the person who started it. Linda's face hardened, but she said nothing and quietly walked away in shame. But the damage was already done. Within weeks, the real story slowly began circulating. People began realizing that Victoria's testimony had actually been genuine. Some felt embarrassed, others felt guilty, but the realization came too late. One evening, few months after everything happened, Sarah visited Victoria at her office. Victoria had just finished the meeting when Sarah arrived. The two women sat together and talked for a while. Eventually, Sarah said something carefully. "You know, people in church finally realized the truth." Victoria smiled faintly. "Did they?" "Yes." Sarah explained how people began realizing the rumors had been lies. Victoria listened carefully, but her expression didn't change. "Some people feel really bad about what happened," Sarah added. Victoria nodded slowly. "I'm sure they do." "Would you ever consider coming back?" Sarah asked gently. Victoria looked out the window for a moment. Then, she shook her head softly. No. Sarah didn't push further because she understood something important. Sometimes, the deepest wounds are not physical. They are wounds caused by betrayal, by gossip, by being judged unfairly by people who should have shown kindness. Victoria eventually looked back at her friend and smiled calmly. "It's okay," she said. "God still blessed me." And this time, she didn't need an altar to prove it. And here is the moral lesson of this story. Many believers celebrate testimonies, but few understand the weight that sometimes follows them. A testimony can inspire faith, but in the wrong environment, it can also attract jealousy, pressure, and gossip. Not everyone who claps when you share good news is truly happy for you, and not every ear that hears your testimony is ready to handle it with maturity. That is why the Bible warns, without a gossip, a quarrel dies down. Proverbs 26 verse 20. Sometimes, the greatest damage is not done by enemies, but by careless words spoken amongst believers. So, be wise with your testimony and be careful with your tongue. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like and share with your friends and families. If you enjoy stories like these, subscribe so you don't miss our next video. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.